Gracias a todos. As Professor Dominguez says, my Spanish is not sufficient to the task of lecturing to you, let alone my Galician. So I appreciate your hospitality in having me here, and having me here in English. Can you hear me in the back? Okay, good. As Professor Dominguez mentioned, I think there was a text that went round through the internet. Did people have a chance to have a look at it? It's only because, and it's always a bit of a risk when you set a piece of work that you've been involved with, because it might seem vainglorious. I hope you don't read it in that way, but the only reason I sent that round is because it raises a few technical points about some methods that I'll contextualize for you a little bit in my talk. But it might have been helpful to get a little bit of a preview of those technical points and methods prior to coming this afternoon. Has anyone encountered GIS, Geographic Information Systems, as a concept before, or even an application?
Well, as a part of one of the subjects we made during this semester, we saw a few points regarding GIS and
spatial term. Yeah, they were more like concepts related to GIS, but it was not GIS specifically.
Yes. Yeah, but it's funny. I mean, I think that's intriguing, though. That often people from a humanities background in studying liberal arts wouldn't have necessarily encountered this technology, but this idea of spatial term, which we might have a chance to think about more generally in the discussion portion of today's time, is an intriguing development that makes these kinds of technologies that were really developed for very different kinds of research fields in the 1960s and 1970s. It's made these technologies more of a current area of interest for scholars in the humanities, whether that happens to be history or literary studies. Beyond that, interesting musical history, art history. But effectively, what Geographic Information Systems technology is about, it's about the collocation, which is a word we'll come back to in a slightly different context in a few minutes, the collocation of two types of information. Geographical, spatial information on the one hand, and thematic or attribute information on the other. So you're all probably familiar with the idea of a census, right? A population census, which is effectively a kind of database, if you want to think of it that way. A database in which geographic information and thematic or attribute information is brought together. So you have particular types of settlements, maybe parishes, towns, cities, boroughs. These are, in a way, types of geographical information. And to those, you have attributed particular kinds of qualities or themes, say demographic information about employment, rates of birth, rates of death, things of this nature. So GIS in some ways is a digital or computational form of that kind of database technology. It brings together locations through geographical information, usually in the form of coordinates, latitude, longitude, northing, southing, things of this nature, to which then are associated particular kinds of attributes. And as a framework, it then facilitates not only analysis, but also visualization. So the making of maps, to be very reductive about it. And this making of maps business, which I think is really intriguing. I'll say a bit about this in a moment, but for those of you maybe in the back who can't read, this is Abraham Ortelius's Typus Orbis Terrarum, 1570, part of the Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, which is recognized as one of the first modern atlases, or map books. It was published in Antwerp in 1570. And when I first started studying history, studying European literature, I was really intrigued by the map as an early modern technology. There's something about the 16th century, the later 16th century, where there's an increasing interest in the spatial organization of knowledge. This idea of the atlas is critical. The atlas is, in a way, the counterpart of the encyclopedia. We think of the encyclopedia typically today as an alphabetical arrangement of information. The atlas is a geographical manifestation of, I think, a very similar kind of scientific urge about the geographical or spatial organization of information. So I think this technology encyclopedia, which is classical, as is the map. These are all things one finds in classical antiquity, of course. But in the early modern period, especially in Europe, this emergence of a new science of encyclopedia, maybe most memorably iterated in the Enlightenment work of people like Diderot, D'Alembert, the Encyclopédie, in the 17th, so the 18th century, but equally this idea of atlas, of map book. Encyclopedia as alphabetical organization, map book as spatial or geographical organization. And current trends in what gets called the spatial humanities, to whatever field within the humanities, whatever discipline in the humanities that are applied, I think tend to harken back to this kind of knowledge organization. So we talk about the use of digital technologies or computational methods. These are new affordances that are available to us as scholars, but ultimately I think the thought process is not fundamentally different than what Ortelius is up to in the 1570s in Belgium. So what we call now spatial humanities has a long intellectual legacy, and I think it's exciting to try to take that into account when introducing the topic. This is a seminar in literary studies. My background initially was in literary studies, and it's something that I've really always had a passion for. And in terms of early mapping, in terms of spatialization, before we come to digital examples, I wanted to turn to this plan, which again, the text is off the screen slightly, but it's Alessandro Vellutello's plan of Vaucluse, which he includes in his Petrarca. So it's an edition of the poet Francisco Petrarca's vulgar works, his non-Latin poetry chiefly, the Rima Sparsa, Petrarch's sonnet sequence. What Vellutello has done here, which I think is very intriguing, is he's included in his edition of the poetry this map that gives you a sense of the geographical space described in the narrative of Petrarch's lyric sequence. So you've encountered the Rima Sparsa, perhaps? Or this is this idea of Petrarch the poet and Laura is innamorata. This is again effectively the narrative that works through Petrarch's lyric sequence, Rima Sparsa. And Vellutello, as a critic, in 1525 is thinking about how a map can be used as a way of organizing that narrative, or at least presenting it to the reader in a different form. I think this is an interesting impulse in the beginnings of what we recognize as modern literary criticism, that mapping technology or geographical representation ends up being a critical component of how we approach the literary work of art. So these are early instantiations of what we now might recognize as a tendency to think of as spatial humanities, or a humanities that involves spatialization, involves geography at some level. And the work I'm involved in is using modern forms of computational geographical technology. Chiefly, what I'll talk about today is GIS, Geographic Information Systems, to undertake similar types of explorations. Now, the example I'm going to share with you, like Professor Domingos hinted, isn't exclusively about works of literature, works of, in English we often would say literature with a capital L. So what we would regard as works of a canon of literature, but also more ephemeral and popular sorts of literary works, guidebooks tourist publications. And part of the reason for that is, as Professor Dominguez mentioned, my research interest at the moment, based as I am in the northwest of England, is focused on this place called the Lake District, which is a place of mountains and lakes, much smaller than the Alps, but has long been, like the Alps, a site of tourism, and even unto today is a significant site for interest in landscape history, but also a landscape history that's blended with an interest in art history, whether that's painting or sketching, or literary history. There's some significant figures in British literary history who have biographical and literary or artistic connections with the region. Foremost among these are the British Romantic poets, William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And it's with Coleridge, portrait here, not from 1840 actually, from slightly earlier than that, but a mezzotint of a portrait of Coleridge. I don't know if you can see. And that's where we'll begin. Because what I'm interested in this case study is the way that aesthetic language gets used. Now, we all know, or at least I think our colleagues in philosophy tell us, that in matters of aesthetic judgment, making a judgment about beauty, majesty, ugliness, much depends on choosing one's words carefully. But as we all know in our everyday life, people don't always choose their words with care. And there's an incident in the life of Coleridge which provides a nice demonstration of this. So apparently, when Coleridge was a young man, in 1803, he was on tour in southern Scotland. He went to see the Falls of Clyde, which are a set of waterfalls. And he was very struck by the highest waterfall called Coralin. And he was standing beside Coralin, and a gentleman and his wife came along. And the gentleman declared, "Oh, it's a majestic waterfall, majestic waterfall." And Coleridge is very excited because he had been scrutinizing in his thinking the precise meaning of the word majestic. So what is majesty? How is it like sublimity, this other concept? How is it like beauty? And he thought the man had used the word majestic in the correct sense, that the waterfall was majestic. That was the correct label. Not beautiful, not sublime, but majestic. Yes, sir, it is a majestic waterfall. At that point, however, the gentleman's wife said, "It's beautiful and sublime as well." And Coleridge, a little disheartened, turned away from the couple, feeling not very desirous to continue the conversation. Now the humor, of course, comes from the fact that we have Coleridge on the one hand expressing a desire for very particular verbal precision about the use of this aesthetic terminology. And we have the ironic coincidence of this couple who are not as discerning. There's a moment of irony here. But there's also, I think, something really meaningful. In the 18th century specifically, especially one thinks, I guess, in Germany, of the works of Immanuel Kant, but in Britain, the contribution prior to Kant of a man named Edmund Burke in a text called The Philosophical Inquiry into Our Ideas of the Beautiful and the Sublime, a significant contribution to the development of aesthetic philosophy in the 18th century. We have put forth some very influential definitions of some of these concepts, beauty, majesty, and sublimity. Now for Burke, these are always thought of in a psychological capacity. Beauty is associated with a small form, with a soft form, with a form that is somehow pleasing. So aesthetically pleasing, but also then psychologically reassuring in some way. The sublime, on the other hand, is sort of the opposite. It's again understood in terms not of small forms, but of usually very large forms. Forms so large that they exceed comprehension. They terrify, they overawe. There's a strong connotation between this idea of sublimity and this idea of awesomeness. Slightly different than how we would use the word sublime, I think, conventionally in English today, where it tends to be just a positive judgment of appearance, or a positive judgment. That sublime, in the context of Burke's inquiry, and in the context of the 18th century, is often strongly associated with that which is too large to comprehend. Too large to comprehend. Now, majesty, on the other hand, is not precisely somewhere between the two, but it's a distinct term that's used to describe forms that are expansive, that impress with power of one sort or another. Burke's example for majesty is you think about the forms of trees, which might be too large to be classified as properly beautiful, but have a kind of majesty, a sort of power. There is a connection, as often is the case in Burke's writing, to a political context, where in English we have the term majesty often used as a modifier for the, or as a noun form for sovereign, the ruler, the majesty, the highest. Now, this is intriguing. This is a model for thinking through these terms that had great influence not on Coleridge's thinking, but on the thinking of authors, philosophers. Really had a broad cultural influence across the 18th into the 19th century. And so it's intriguing to take into consideration the degree to which people are adhering to these definitions or not. And if we begin to look at a body of work about a particular region, and we're interested in the kinds of associations that are attributed to places, whether they're beauty, majesty, sublimity, or another word which I'll come to in just a moment, picturesque, then we can begin to use large collections of sources to see, well, are people generally using these words indiscriminately to describe just lots of different sorts of places? Or does there seem to be some amount of selectivity? Are people using these terms to describe specific types of locations? And by studying the types of locations those words are associated with, can we begin to understand more precisely what the definitions ascribed to them, whether it's by a thinker like Burke, or a thinker like William Gilpin, whom we'll come in a moment. What we can understand by the way these words are used about the definitions that are being applied to them in the period. Now, I mentioned this idea of picturesque, which I single out possibly as deserving its own moment. Is this a term you're familiar with, the idea of a picturesque experience? And that's quite all right, because I think it's terminology that is still used today in English, but has a specific valence, or a set of specific valences or meanings in the 18th, 19th century. It's associated with a cultural movement, which I think characterizes British culture more strongly than European culture generally. This is a movement of fine art, of landscape depiction, but also of verbal art, of this description of landscape. But typically in the work of a man named William Gilpin, who was an influential contemporary of Burke. His dates are 1724 to 1804. And it takes on the definition of being a term descriptive of the kind of beauty that is pleasing in a picture. The picturesque is that which is in some sense pictorial. Now, this is a definition that other philosophers in the period dispute. There are thinkers like Hugh Dale Price, slightly later, Richard Payne Knight, who qualify or disagree with Gilpin's definition of picturesque. They say picturesqueness isn't so much about the kind of beauty that fits in a picture. It's more about how one classifies irregular forms, forms that are rough or gnarled or misshapen. There's something picturesque about them. They create variegation, shadows playing off of them. This is a picturesquism. So I was interested in these words: beautiful, sublime, picturesque, and majestic. Thinking about the meanings that one associates with them in the period. And then using spatial humanities approaches to begin to understand how these words are actually being applied in more popular forms of writing. Here we have aesthetic treatises that are generally a kind of polite literature. But in the more ephemeral, more popular literature of guidebooks and travelogues, what do we learn about the way these words are actually being used? And I mentioned working with large collections of text. Now, we'll come back to In the spatial humanities research, people are often borrowing, drawing on ideas from corpus linguistics, which is effectively a computational variation on linguistic scholarship. And they use the term corpus, which I always still think of as body. It very much is that. It's a body, a collection of different types of information. In this case, I'm specifically interested in collections of texts. So people will talk about a corpus or corpora, referring to a collection of different kinds of texts that have been selected or grouped together on the basis of some kind of shared identity. In this case, the corpus that interests us is a corpus of 80 words from the beginning of the 17th century through to the end of the 19th century that are, for the most part, guidebooks and travel logs and accounts of travel through the Lake District, this region in northwest England of lakes and mountains. Now, so it's in terms of genre, relatively heterogeneous corpus. In terms of its chronological range, it's relatively heterogeneous. It cuts across 3 recognized period groupings in British cultural and literary and art history. The first being what we might roughly call the long 18th century, from 1688, which is a significant date in British political history. It's the date of the Glorious Revolution, whereby the Protestant Queen Mary and the Duke of Orange, William of the Low Country, ascended to the throne, through to 1789, which is the date of the French Revolution, which, though an event with principal significance for French history, is also very significant for European history as a whole, and certainly for British history. Then between 1789 and 1837 we have the Romantic period, the British Romantic period, which is specifically, I think, interested in British literature, more so than British music or British art. So the long 18th century Romantic period, and then finally the sort of regnal period, the Victorian era, which is distinct from the Romantic period as a cultural epoch, not only because this is a period when Victoria sits on the British throne, but it ushers in a series of social, cultural, economical changes, political changes, that have a perceptible influence on the culture. So that's a long-winded way of saying that the corpus is not only heterogeneous or varied in terms of genre, but also in terms of time period. And I think this is something that is significant about spatial humanities' ways of working. As scholars, regardless of what our specific national interests might be, if we're thinking of literary scholarship, we tend to divide down our work in terms of time. We think of distinctive period groupings. In British literature, European literature, one speaks of the modernist period to describe not only a set of conventions, maybe even a canon of authors, but also a time period. We think of modernism as being circumscribed by a particular era. Equally, you might think of the High Medieval period or the Renaissance. These are temporal groupings that organize the way we work. Now, I think what spatial humanities begins to allow for is a shift of epistemology, or a different way of thinking about our subject matter. We think not only in terms of time, but also in terms of location. So we take an interest in a specific place. It could be Santiago, it could be anywhere. And Santiago has a rich history, a heterogeneous history, and a very long history. And instead of selecting only a period, we began to use that place as a way of organizing accounts from across time, reading them together, using space as a way of organizing our work in relation to time. I don't think we can dispense with time altogether. What I think spatial humanities begins to allow for is a way of thinking about how space and time are in tandem with each other. So, to give a little précis of our methods in this project, because I was going to end on the hour, so we can have some time for discussion. We have the corpus. We also have the use of particular methods that are conventional in corpus linguistics. One of those methods is collocation analysis. And I used the term collocation earlier as a way of thinking about bringing things together. We might talk about the collocation of space and time in this regard. But in corpus analysis, in corpus linguistics, it has a more specific meaning. It's referring to the study of, and usually the computationally facilitated study, of elements of lexis, so words, word choices, and or annotation, punctuation, other kinds of apparatus of language, of written language, that co-occur more frequently than would be expected. So looking through a collection of texts, identifying, okay, I have this term, what are the other terms that frequently associate with this term? So we're borrowing from corpus analysis, the method of collocation analysis, as a way of thinking about the 4 search terms I was mentioning, these aesthetic concepts: beauty, picturesque, majesty, sublimity, and thinking what place names are associated with them. The collocation analysis as a method tends to rely on the study of proximity. So how many words appear alongside the word I'm interested in? And in order to study something on the basis of proximity, you need to think about, well, how close to the word itself constitutes proximity to the word that interests me. So if I'm interested in the word beauty, how many spaces to either side of that word constitutes a relationship of proximity? In corpus analysis, working with English corpora, English language corpora, the convention is in modern English language corpora, like the British National Corpus, which is a conventionally and very useful resource, conventionally used and very useful resource for modern corpus analysis. People tend to use a boundary of about 5 words on either side of your search term. And that constitutes a relationship of significance. Now, the average length of a sentence in the British National Corpus is 16 words. In our corpus, these historical texts, the average sentence length is 29 words. It varies from work to work, but because the syntactical and typographical conventions of written English change between the beginning of the 17th century and the end of the 19th century, we end up with a very long average sentence length. And so in order to capture that length, we've used a proximity of 10 words on either side. So the example I've given you here, which slightly overreaches the slide, the screen, shows us that we might have the concept beautiful in the center of the second line, and then spanning to the left and to the right of the word beautiful, we can pick up particular place names. Lord's Island, Skiddaw, which is a hill, which we'll talk about, a mountain, particularly interesting. These are then collocates of the word beautiful. Now, this kind of methodology, which is relying on proximity, also requires one to check for negation. If you're interested in places that are described as beautiful, you ought to be considering places that might be described as not beautiful. So in addition to combing through the corpus automatically using this approach, we've also had to double check the results to see where negation is an element and to take account of that. So if a place is described as beautiful, that's meaningful in one sense. If it's described as not beautiful, that's meaningful in another sense, but one needs to take account of this. So there's a combination of automated procedure, but also of more traditional manual reading, manually informed scholarly work. We also use, and I'm happy to say more about this kind of process in the Q&A. It's a little bit technical, and I talk about it a little bit in that chapter we sent around, a tool called the Edinburgh GeoParser. And more there are freely accessible online, these kinds of resources where you might be able to upload text in the information of a text file, unformatted text, and have that text read to identify the place names it contains, place name entities they're often referred to, as well as having those place name entities assigned geographical coordinates. This comes back to that sense of geographical information I mentioned in the beginning, that we want to identify what geographical information the work contains, what place names are there, and what coordinates correspond to those place names. So there's a process of automatically reading and geotagging is the term, a text, and then identifying the place names in the text and to those place names attributing particular kinds of geographical coordinates. That latter step, the attributing of coordinates, involves the use of gazetteers and is often referred to as georesolution, or more generally the process is called georeferencing. The long and the short of it is it takes, say, an unstructured text such as this one, which you don't need to be able to read from the back, it's all right. This is an example of the kind of hypertext you might have here, scripted out in XML, which is a markup system for working with text in the digital medium. You would feed this through the GeoParser process, and it would make it even messier to read. But the idea is that along the side here you have in angle brackets then place names identified and geographical coordinates allocated to them. So you've uploaded a text, you've identified the place names mentioned in that text, and you've allocated coordinate information to those place names. The next step that brings in the use of geographic information systems is that you would extract that information, the names, the text around those names, and the coordinates, which allows you to begin projecting. I don't know if you can see that very clearly, but to begin projecting that information into a cartographical environment onto the map. So what we have here is an example of two different kinds of mappings that are developed from, look at this example, two different kinds of mappings that are being developed from the information that the GeoParser created. On the one hand, we have mapping that uses points, distribution mapping, which shows you all the places mentioned in relation to the word that you're interested in. So I'm interested in the word beautiful. This shows us every point in the region identified with the word beautiful. Now that kind of distribution mapping is very handy to get a sense of the spread of locations across the region, but it doesn't help us really think about intensity. So we get a sense of the spread, but not of any side of intensity, the extension, but not the intention. And there are other mapping